Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming and welcome to our Poison Planet Conference. We honor the following for making this event happen. Thank you to our sponsors, KBOO Radio, Veterans for Peace Chapter 72, Columbia Riverkeeper, Students United for Nonviolence, and Physicians for Social Responsibility. Organizers Steve Erickson, Kim Tolomei, Marianne Brera-Sonic, Mel Ressler, Chris Knight, Sean Lewis, and Bob Goss. And financial contributors Amir Yadzani and Bruce Schneider from Newhouse Hutchins Towing. I would like to introduce our first speaker for the day, Dr. Thomas Fazey, Associate Professor of Pathology at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, who traveled to Iraq twice in 2003 and met with Professor Alim Yaqub, the Iraqi epidemiologist investigating childhood cancer and birth defects in southern Iraq. Dr. Fazey will present his research on the impact of depleted uranium weapons used during Gulf War and the implications for the health of those in the war zone, the region, and the planet. Dr. Fazey is an expert in the area of nuclear toxicology and has been studying this since the mid-50s. Dr. Fazey?
Thank you, Malcolm. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Could I have the next slide? It's a pleasure to participate in this conference, and I want to thank all the organizers for the invitation. Could you show the next slide? I've always been impressed by this painting, I think by a French-Canadian painter, Michel Granger. And it reminds me of a quotation of Buckminster Fuller, who said, on Spaceship Earth, there are no passengers. Everyone is crew. And I think increasingly we're recognizing the important role that we need to play as citizens and as informed citizens. And in particularly at this time, to use actually an Iraqi metaphor, at this time when our national leaders cannot read the handwriting on the wall. Of course, that refers back to an incident that supposedly happened in Nebuchadnezzar's temple in Babylon. And Babylon, if there were no checkpoints, it would be an hour-and-a-half drive south of Baghdad. But the handwriting on the wall was quite ominous, and the king was unable and unwilling to read it. So I think we have an obligation to become informed and develop a vision and to become more active. I think increasingly we're depending on civil society to solve national and international problems. Okay, so let's jump right in to a quick review of the history of uranium. The next slide. So uranium was discovered by Klaproth in 1789, and not too much later, it was found to be toxic in experimental animals, and that information has consistently been reinforced. And in 1888, uranium was found to be acutely toxic to the kidneys. And in 1896, Becquerel in Paris was doing experiments with uranyl potassium sulfate and accidentally discovered that uranyl ions are radioactive. But the next, in the very beginning of the Manhattan Project, a feasibility panel was commissioned to determine whether or not it would be feasible to build a uranium-235 fission bomb in time to influence the outcome of the war. And within a short time, this panel reported back to President Roosevelt that yes, it would be feasible, but there were two caveats. It would be extremely expensive, and it would require at least 10,000 workers to mine uranium, to purify or extract and purify uranium, and to enrich uranium-235. And they said, we know that uranium is toxic. And so accordingly, a little bit later, as part of the Manhattan Project, a rather large-scale uranium toxicology research program was started. It took place mainly at the University of Rochester, but also in sites in Chicago and also in some of the national laboratories. And a great deal was learned about the toxicity in different mammalian species and the toxicity when it's administered by different routes. So it was recognized before the Manhattan Project that uranium is toxic. In the film, which I thought was very interesting and informative, but I think there was a statement that said surreptitiously in the 1970s, 1980s, there was research began in uranium weapons. But it actually began much earlier, at least by 1958. There was a company west of Albany, New York, Lead Technologies, that received a contract to make uranium bullets. And that company made uranium weapons for 23 years before they were closed down by the state of New York because of extensive contamination in the plant and the immediate vicinity. So the DU weapons actually have a long history, and we tend to think of where are the sites that are contaminated with depleted uranium. Yes, there's Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia, Iraq, and various other places, but there are quite a few. There are at least dozens of places in the United States that are contaminated with uranium oxide dust from depleted uranium weapons. And some, in a few cases, like Albany, the contamination is long-standing. Okay, let's just quickly look at the next slide, which is a picture of Becquerel. So at the time he discovered radioactivity using a uranium compound, uranium was well recognized to be toxic, to be chemically toxic. The next slide, please. So this is a simple summary slide of the multifaceted nature of uranium toxicity. It's well recognized to be a kidney toxin, and also it was well established during the Manhattan Project that uranium is a neurotoxin, and It's also recognized to be a carcinogen, a mutagen, an agent that can cause DNA damage and gene mutations. And it is established in experimental animals to be a teratogen, an inducer of birth defects. And also it is a modulator of the immune system. It switches the immune system to favor allergic responses and autoimmune responses. And in several ways, these toxicities may interact. But the next slide there, it is sometimes implied that all of the toxicity of uranium is mediated by radiation, but that certainly isn't true. And in fact, all of the early onset acute manifestations of uranium toxicity, and especially toxicity to the kidney, is chemically mediated. It's the heavy metal effects of uranium. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So for quite some time, it has been recognized that uranyl ions bind to DNA. They bind in the minor groove of DNA, and while bound to DNA, they are chemically reactive. That is, they can catalyze the formation of free radicals which may damage DNA. And that DNA damage is chemically mediated. There also may be some contribution of radiation to DNA damage. But it's important to remember that uranyl ions, the form of uranium that predominates inside the body, uranyl ions bind to DNA. So they're in a critical position to cause DNA damage. All right, the next slide. So we saw in the film a review of these depleted uranium kinetic energy penetrators, which do not look like the traditional shell or bullet. They look more like a dart or an arrow. They have a very sharp tip. And the principles of the kinetic energy penetrator require that the penetrator be very dense or have a maximum mass, but also that it be fired at an extremely high velocity, and also that its point of impact is very small. So when it hits a hard target, much of the kinetic energy is immediately converted to heat at the point of impact. So that heat is applied at a very, very small area on the target and tends to cause it to melt and allow penetration. But that penetration often causes friction that sets the penetrator on fire, and at least part of it undergoes combustion. It burns, and it releases, while it burns, it reacts with oxygen and releases uranium oxide dust particles, some of which are very, very small. So the next slide. So why are very small uranium oxide dust particles dangerous? Well, there's several reasons. One is that the uranium oxide dust particles contain extremely high concentration of uranium oxides. It's probably at least 50%. There are other things mixed in, nickel and iron metals from the target, but it has an extremely high concentration of uranium oxide, and we're never exposed to such high concentrations normally in the environment. And many of these dust particles are very, very small, and some smaller than a micron in diameter. Therefore, they are readily inhaled into and retained by the lungs. So the next slide. So compared to the uranium naturally present in the environment, DU dust particles contain uranium that's vastly more bioavailable and more readily internalized by inhalation. The next slide emphasizes a basic principle of toxicology. In toxicology, obviously, the higher doses of a toxic substance cause more injury than lower doses, but the route of exposure to a toxic substance is critically important to determining the extent of injury. And an obvious example would be that an intravenous exposure to a toxic substance would cause more injury than, let's say, application to the sole of one's foot. And that's almost trivial, but I would like to move on to another, to compare and contrast two other routes of exposure, particularly to uranium oxides, and that is exposure by inhalation and exposure by ingestion. So could we move to the next slide? Okay, so on the left-hand side of this simple diagram is the GI tract. And the GI tract, and on the upper right-hand side is a simplified diagram of the lung. So these two routes differ in important ways. The GI tract, has a beginning and an end. So what enters, into the mouth after 2 or 3 days passes through out the anus, and the GI tract is largely impermeable to uranium, and especially to poorly soluble uranium compounds like uranium oxides. In contrast, the mucosa lining the upper and the lower airways of the lung are more permeable to dissolved uranium, and the lung does not have an exit, so any particles that get deep in the lungs, in the alveoli, essentially stay there forever unless they melt or are picked up by phagocytic cells and carried to the lymph nodes that drain the lungs. So for poorly or moderately soluble uranium oxides, exposure by inhalation causes much more damage than exposure by ingestion, because there's actually very little uptake from the GI tract. Okay, so could we move on to the next slide? And I think this is an important, actually, let's return back to the previous slide if we can. So we could consider inhalational exposures are orders of magnitude more toxic than exposures by ingestion. And if uranium oxides particles in the environment were converted to a form that couldn't enter the lung, they would be much less toxic. So let's move to the next slide, which I think makes that point. So it's often said that the contamination from depleted uranium in the environment will persist for billions of years. And I don't think that this is likely the case, that it probably will persist in the environment for years or decades, but eventually by oxidation or by melting or by dispersal and by the winds, the contamination will gradually dissipate. And it's difficult to say how long that will take, but it will not persist for billions of years. But any weapon that persists on the battlefield after the war is over is considered an illegal weapon. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, and actually the one after that, the next one. Okay, so I just want to quickly run through some chemistry of there are several uranium oxides, and the major ones, the major three, are listed here. And uranium dioxide on the upper left is very, very insoluble, and whereas uranium trioxide is moderately soluble, and the other one in the middle has intermediate solubility. So let's just look at the next slide to look at the fate of these different uranium oxide particles that differ on the basis of their solubility. So on the upper left, the uranium dioxide enters the lung, and it just really isn't able to melt in lung fluids. It persists, but gradually it's carried to the lymph nodes that drain the lungs, and after months or years, it tends to concentrate in those lymph nodes. Whereas the uranium trioxide, which is moderately soluble, eventually does dissolve. It enters the circulation, and it basically is carried to every organ. And as was mentioned in the film, it can pass the placenta, it can pass the blood-brain barrier. But the main storage depot is in the bone and teeth. But whatever is in the bloodstream, much of that gets excreted by the kidneys. So let's look at the next slide, which I think lists the target organs or the organs of accumulation following an inhalational exposure to uranium dioxide. So it enters the lungs. Some of it stays there for a long time, and some melts, gets into the circulation, and is gradually excreted by the kidneys, and much of it is stored in bones and teeth, and some of what is in the lungs initially gets carried to the lymph nodes, draining the lungs, where it persists for a long time. The Department of Energy has a program that encourages retired uranium workers to donate their body to science. And there have been several such donations which have been analyzed and published. And most of the total body uranium, most of that is in the bones and the teeth. But the organ that has the highest concentration of uranium, and in some cases it's an extraordinarily high concentration of uranium, are the pulmonary lymph nodes, the tracheobronchial lymph nodes. Okay, so Let's move on to the next slide. So this, again, is a review of the areas or the main toxicities of uranium. And I would like to review some of the signs and symptoms that occur from uranium poisoning. And this is a compilation of a review of the medical scientific literature, and including a few studies in humans, many studies in experimental animals. But it also includes the symptoms that were manifest in a cohort of 10 New York City soldiers who had documented contamination with depleted uranium based on urine tests that showed abnormal ratios of uranium isotopes in their urine. Okay, so that's the next slide just sort of elaborates on what I just said. These New York City soldiers were exposed in the summer of 2003 in the south of Iraq in a town on the Euphrates River called As Samoa. And their urine was analyzed about 4 months after their presumptive exposure ended. And they subsequently filed suit against the Army for their injuries, and therefore they elaborated their symptoms in the motion that was filed. So the next slide. So a very prominent early symptom, which sometimes an early set of symptoms which sometimes persist, are kidney symptoms. And those include blood in the urine, gross or occult hematuria, and also protein in the urine. And also, this usually doesn't last more than a few weeks or months, but many of these soldiers complained of or noticed an inability to concentrate their urine. So a normal adult excretes 2 or 3 liters of urine a day, and some of these individuals were excreting 10 or 15 liters of urine a day. And that's reflective of the injury to the kidney tubules. They were not able to reabsorb water. And many of them also complained of kidney stones or symptoms that were consistent with kidney stones, flank pain. And they also complained of burning in their urethra upon urination. Okay, the next slide reviews some neurologic symptoms. And one I should have listed first visual disturbances, which include blurred vision, double vision, distorted vision of various kinds. And many of them who never had problems with headaches developed almost daily migraine headaches. And many of those had a light sensitivity, photophobia. And many of them had various cognitive difficulties, short-term memory loss, and difficulty concentrating. And several complained of erectile dysfunction, which I would consider to be a manifestation of injury to the autonomic nervous system. And many of them complained of numbness, and also some complained of dizziness. And just as a perspective, During the Manhattan Project in the mid-1940s, rabbits, which are more sensitive than most species to uranium, when they were dosed with uranium, mainly to find, what was the lethal dose, or what was the LD50 that would kill half the animals that received that dose. It was noticed that some of the rabbits developed spasticity in their hind legs, which in some cases went on to paralysis. Some of the rabbits developed convulsions, seizures, and some of them showed loss of balance. So the neurotoxicity of uranium has been recognized for, at least 6 decades. The next slide. So many of the New York City soldiers have complained of fatigue and sleep disorders and mood disorders, and also of fibromyalgia, which is a chronic, widespread pain syndrome. And so these also are features of so-called Gulf War syndrome. And the next slide in this set just points out that several of the soldiers have, when they returned, developed allergic and autoimmune symptoms, and several of these had to do with the skin, and several of them developed swelling, asymmetrical swelling of their face or one side of their face, or of their hand or hands. And they also complained of joint pain and muscle pain. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, which has to do with testing. If the uranium weapons were not made of depleted uranium, but were simply made of natural uranium, they would be just as toxic, or at least just as chemically toxic. But if uranium weapons were made of natural uranium, they wouldn't be traceable. They wouldn't have a signature. They would have the normal natural isotope ratio. But depleted uranium has an abnormal isotope ratio. It has much less uranium-235 and uranium-234. And so it is possible with modern technology, and specifically with mass spectroscopy, to detect the presence of 1% depleted uranium in the urine of someone who's has a mixture of 99% natural uranium, 1% depleted uranium. It's possible to say with certainty that there's an abnormal isotope ratio. There's some depleted uranium in this sample. And the gold standard now has become a test that was described by Professor Parrish in February of 2006 in one of the in the journal Health Physics. And that describes in some detail the urine test for exposure to depleted uranium. And as you know, several states, Louisiana, Connecticut, New York, and hopefully Oregon, have passed laws in the state legislature that would facilitate such testing for veterans returning from Iraq. Okay, so the next slide just reviews again the target organs where uranium accumulates in the body. And in individuals, let's say, who were exposed to depleted uranium in February 1991 may no longer have detectable depleted uranium in their urine, but it's very likely that they would have detectable depleted uranium stored in their bones and teeth, and even more likely that they would have depleted uranium in the lymph nodes that drain their lungs. Okay, so I would like to just finish up with two additional topics. So could we quickly look at this slide, and which is an ancient mosque in Baghdad, and the next slide, which shows Dr. Yaqub and Dr. Hassan. Dr. Yaqub tragically died in early 2004, and Dr. Hassan is a pediatric oncologist in Basra, and they documented together an increased incidence of childhood cancer in the province of Basra, and also an increased incidence of birth defects in Basra. So I'm just going to review quickly three charts or graphs. So let's look at the first one. So this, the horizontal line is which comes to 0 on the left is the incidence of childhood cancers in 1990, before the Gulf War started, and listed in subsequent years are increases or decreases. So after a latency of 6 years or so, there was an increase in all childhood cancers, shown in the red line, and in childhood leukemias, shown in the yellow line. I don't have, I believe that the data is still being collected, but I don't have the data for recent years. The next slide focuses on an age breakdown of childhood leukemia over these years. So in red, the red spike shows the number of cases of childhood leukemia in children under 5, and the green spike, shows leukemia in children between the ages of 10 and 15, and the yellow between ages 5 and 9. So let's look at 1990. In 1990, in this hospital, which diagnoses and treats all the children in the province of Basra suspected to have leukemia or other cancers, in 1990 there were 2 cases of leukemia in children under the age of 5. In 2002, there were 53 cases of leukemia in children under the age of 5. So that really is a striking and worrisome increase. And from my perspective, it's not possible to say to what extent depleted uranium in the environment may have contributed to this increase. The nutritional factors and other factors may have contributed to this effect, but that really is a worrisome increase. So the next slide shows changes in the incidence of birth defects in one hospital, which accounted for approximately 20% of all the births in the province of Basra. So if there were roughly 3 per 1,000 live births, 3 children with congenital malformations per 1,000 live births in 1990, but there were 7 times more in the year 2001. So that also is a worrisome increase, and the extent to which depleted uranium contributed to that is difficult to say. However, it is known from experiments on animals that uranium is a carcinogen and uranium is a teratogen. It can induce birth defects. Okay, so I'd like to finish up with just a brief review of international law relevant to this case. So could we skip the next slide and go on to the one after that? So uranium oxide dust derived from depleted uranium weapons is inherently toxic. It's intrinsically indiscriminate. It injures soldiers on both sides as well as civilians. It damages the environment. It persists on the battlefield. It's not confined to the battlefield, and it causes superfluous injury. So because of these features, the next slide, please. The United Nations Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights has consistently ruled that depleted uranium weapons are incompatible with existing international humanitarian and human rights laws. And the next slide lists some of the other weapons that are also considered to be incompatible with existing international humanitarian law, and that includes, in addition to DU weapons, cluster bombs, fuel air bombs, and both of which have been used in Iraq, as well as other weapons. So I think I should stop there, and thank you very much for your attention. So I'd be happy to respond to any specific questions that may arise.
From the Gulf War was, are you familiar with Busby's work about the radiation drift from the Gulf War II that showed up in the United Kingdom?
Yes, I am. And actually, just before responding to that you may remember in the Army training film, there was a quick statement that, soldiers should be warned to not get closer than 50 feet or 50 meters from a damaged tank that presumably, was contaminated with depleted uranium dust. And that implies that depleted uranium dust isn't carried in the air. But this scientist in Wales, Chris Busby, I believe he demanded through Freedom of Information Act intervention to get the records of a nuclear safety monitoring station which had air filters on its roof to measure the amount of uranium. And I'm not sure if it was every 3 days or every week or what the period was, but they had kept consistent records, and there was some fluctuation in the amount of uranium that was detected in the filters. But within, I think within 10 or 15 days after the beginning of shock and awe, there was an 8-fold increase in the amount of uranium that was detected in the air filters of this one monitoring station. And that could not be accounted for by any accident in some nuclear power station anywhere in Europe, let alone in England. And so that was published initially as a report on the internet, but it subsequently was published in a journal. I don't have the citation, but the authors were Chris Busby and Saoirse Morgan. And that, but I think that really makes the point that although uranium oxide dust particles may be 10 or 11 times more dense than water, when they're very, very small, the gravitational force that's pulling them to the Earth is very, very weak, and they can be buoyed up by the viscous forces of the air and carried by the winds, and they may disperse considerable distances. So that's what I remember of the report of Chris Busby and Saoirse Morgan.
My name is Mike Hasty. Excuse me, I'm a member of Veterans for Peace. I was a medic in Vietnam. I have a question. With all the research that you've done and the statistics and the data and the tremendous amount of work you've done in reference to Gulf War I, what is your crystal ball telling us about what's currently happening in the Middle East now, especially in Iraq, with the use of depleted uranium and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so I think, it's difficult to say. There's very, very limited data available. Although I was told by some Iraqi physicians that they are seeing an increased frequency in kidney stones, and although they are trying to establish better cancer registries, it does seem that there are increases in several kinds of cancer. And so it is difficult to project the extent of the damage that may be caused by depleted uranium, but it's likely to cause many negative health effects.
Dr. Fazey, one more question? Yes?
Yeah.
Sir?
Yes, my name is Ken Schwelk. I'm a member of the Veterans for Peace chapter in Olympia, Washington, Chapter 109. First of all, Dr. Fazey, you've talked about the New York vets who came back and what they've been experiencing. Why aren't we seeing more of this kind of situation occurring in other parts of the country? I guess I don't quite understand what's happening there. Is it just that no tests are being done, or what? How do you assess that situation?
Yeah, I guess it's the test that they had was paid for by the New York Daily News, which is hardly a radical newspaper, but. Yeah. And I periodically get emails or phone calls from veterans who had returned from Iraq, and a few quite recently. And when they tell me their symptoms, I said to two of them that, I'm 99% certain you're suffering from uranium poisoning, and you could. If your exposure ended recently, you could take this test and pay $1,000 for it. But if you want to use it for litigation purposes, fine. But I think there's no question in my mind that you have uranium poisoning from the symptoms that you have told me. And but I think it is important to have more cases documented, by a sensitive test for clarification and for litigation purposes.
One other thing, just to mention this, the state of Washington did do a study on this very subject as a result of a Senate bill that was passed last year. Are you aware of that? The Joint Committee on Veterans and Military Affairs, Depleted Uranium Exposure Effects and Recommendations?
No, I'm not. I know of Jim McDermott's efforts in the House, and I know that some scientists at the University of Washington are collaborating with Iraqi scientists. But I don't know of the bill you just cited. I'd like to hear more about it.
Perhaps we should get a copy of this to you.
Yes, thanks.